You're watching Capital City Sunday.
Welcome back. I'm joined by Josh Kaul, the Democratic candidate for Attorney General. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you held your first debate over the weekend, and of course your opponent is Brad Schimel, the incumbent Republican. On the table, a lot about your record as a prosecutor. You came from Baltimore. I first want to ask you a little bit about some stuff that was talked about. Handling the crime backlog and sexual assault kits in that backlog has been a lot involved in this race between you and Brad Schimel. According to annual crime lab reports looking back the past few years, the state crime labs are taking longer to test things like DNA, drugs, and gun evidence. What would be your approach to handle that situation?
Yeah, I think that the crime labs have been mismanaged by our current Attorney General, and I think we need an AG who's going to make it a priority to make sure that tests are happening efficiently at the state crime labs. So there are, I think, three things that we need to do and that I would work to do in my first 100 days as Attorney General. First, I think we need to make sure that our crime labs have the resources that they need to make sure that these delays in testing times have been addressed. Our AG just this year finally had an independent analysis conducted, and I think that that's a good starting point, but I think our AG also needs to talk to folks who work in the crime labs and figure out exactly what resources we need and then go to the legislature and request those resources. Secondly, I think our laws need to be updated so that it's clear when kits need to be submitted to the crime labs for testing. And then third, I think our AG needs to play a leading role in making sure that people are being, law enforcement agencies around the state are getting guidance and being trained so that the rules that are in place are known to everybody. And this is a difference in the AG's race. Our AG waited until 33 days before Election Day to finally issue a plan on this. He prioritized all sorts of other things before this, including spending money on promotional materials, filing a lawsuit that's seeking to invalidate the Affordable Care Act and would take protections away from people with pre-existing conditions, and a number of other things.
Speaking of just crime labs and how those are handled, you said that was mishandled. How are they mishandled?
Well, our AG hasn't taken serious action to address these increasing delays in testing times. The report that he had commissioned showed that there's mismanagement in a variety of ways. There's low morale at the crime labs. So we needed to elect somebody as AG who's going to make it a priority to address these issues.
Does that mean more staffing, more resources?
I think it's clearly going to mean more staffing and resources, but we also need to have an AG who's going to be monitoring what's going on at the crime labs and being active about finding solutions to make sure that this problem doesn't persist, because when there are delays at our crime labs, what that results in is a delay in getting justice in cases, and that people who've committed crimes potentially remain on the streets longer than they should.
Your opponent is open to a 72-hour mandate for police to submit rape kits. Do you think that's a realistic approach that can be brought to Wisconsin, and what do you think about a 72-hour waiting period?
I think that is a realistic approach, and I think having a mandate that requires law enforcement to get kits submitted for testing promptly is the key, and so I think we need to clarify state law on that.
It is one of the most it would be one of the most aggressive approaches in the nation. You think it would still be realistic?
I do, yes.
Now, I also want to ask you, Schimel is on air with an attack ad calling basically your record thin and that you're easy on drug dealers. What would be your response to that? He's talking about your record as a prosecutor in Baltimore.
Well, my record is, this is an attempt to mischaracterize my record and to distract from Brad Schimel's record on issues as Attorney General. I was a federal prosecutor in one of the most violent cities in the country. I prosecuted murderers, gang members, and drug traffickers, and I'm proud to put my record as a federal prosecutor up against Brad Schimel's record as AG, where we've seen failure after failure on issue after issue. And I'll give you one example. Our backlog of untested rape kits was mishandled by our current AG. In his first year in office, we received millions of dollars to test those kits. But after Schimel had been AG for 2 years, only 9 out of more than 4,000 kits that needed to be tested had been tested. And while progress has finally been made, what that delay has meant is that there's been a delay in getting justice for survivors of sexual assault, and that dangerous criminals have remained on the streets longer than they should have. It's now been over 3 years since we received funding, and only 3 people have been charged as a result of the testing of the kits in the backlog, and there hasn't yet been a single conviction. We need to do better, and I think we need an AG who's going to make it a priority to get justice for survivors of sexual assault.
Do you think it's a challenge in your campaign since you've never prosecuted in the state of Wisconsin?
I think my record as a federal prosecutor, as I said, in one of the most violent cities in the country, is the kind of experience that we need in our Attorney General. As I mentioned, I worked on drug trafficking cases, and one of the places where we need a more effective response is with our opioid epidemic and now our growing meth problem. Part of what I think we need to do to take those on is to make sure that our enforcement efforts are targeting large-scale traffickers, people who are sending heroin and fentanyl and meth across county lines and state lines. I'm proud to have worked to dismantle drug trafficking conspiracies as a federal prosecutor, and I think our AG's office needs to play a bigger role in those sort of enforcement efforts. I also think we need to expand access to treatment and have an AG who's going to be serious about holding the pharmaceutical companies accountable for their role in this epidemic.
You've recently faced some criticism about 3 specific cases that you handled in Baltimore when it comes to drug distributors, which agreed to prison sentences that were far below the minimum sentence.
So again, these are cases where particular parts of these cases are being taken out of context. In one of these cases, I believe that over 70 people total were charged as part of a drug trafficking effort. In federal court, 9 people were charged, and one of the people was sentenced to 19 years in prison. One was sentenced to 16 years in prison, and I believe 2 others. One was sentenced to 10 years, and one was sentenced to over 12 years. So that's 2 of the 3 cases you're mentioning are part of that effort. And so this is a case where a drug conspiracy was dismantled, and people who were significant drug traffickers got very serious sentences.
And also in the news last week was new Marquette University Law School poll numbers. This time, Schimmel just leads by 4%, but not much name recognition. About 81% still don't know who you are. How do you change that? How do you transform your campaign, and just as we're weeks away from the election?
Yeah, there are a few things. One is we'll be up on TV soon, and that's going to help us get our message out around the state. And we're going to continue traveling around Wisconsin, talking to people about the issues, the clear differences between Brad Schimmel and me. And there are clear differences on issue after issue. We touched on this before, but Brad Schimmel is one of the leaders of a lawsuit that is seeking to invalidate the Affordable Care Act and would eliminate protections for people with pre-existing conditions. I think we need to be working to expand access to affordable health insurance coverage in Wisconsin and working to reduce costs. And as AG, I'll seek to withdraw the state of Wisconsin from that lawsuit.
And also, last week you had more than a dozen former assistant attorney generals all kind of talking out publicly for the first time, supporting a candidate. How does it feel to have that support and have those people backing you, and especially speaking out for the first time, some who even worked under former Republican attorney generals?
I'm proud to have the support of former assistant AGs. 61 total have endorsed my campaign for Attorney General, and 45 signed on to a letter explaining that the AG's office is a mess. I think that sends a clear signal from people who know the AG's office very well that the AG's office has been mismanaged under Brad Schimmel and that we need new leadership. One of the people who spoke at that press conference was elected as a DA as a Republican. And the fact that they have 45 AGs signed a letter is a strong indication that they know that there's a need for change. This is, to my knowledge, not something that has happened in previous elections where dozens of former assistant attorney generals have spoken out against, to call for change in the AG's office.
A last question for you. During that press conference that you held, you also said that you will uphold the law when it comes to the redistricting case. Many Democrats call it gerrymandering in the state. Why would you uphold that law? I know you've talked briefly that that's kind of your duty, but most Democrats would like to see that changed.
Yeah, so the AG's role is to be the attorney for the state of Wisconsin to defend state statutes or state agency actions if there's a reasonably defensible basis to do so. If the AG doesn't do that, often outside counsel is brought in to represent the state. And I think that part of the AG's job is to defend state law, even if the AG personally disagrees with it, if there's a reasonably defensible basis to do so. Now, I also think the AG should advocate for changes to law that are going to serve the interests of the people of Wisconsin. And so when it comes to redistricting, we've spent some, a fair amount of money defending these maps, and I don't think that maps drawn by politicians are in the best interests of voters. I think we should have a nonpartisan redistricting process. So I think it's appropriate to advocate for a change in the law, and I have and will continue to do so. But the AG, from a legal standpoint, should also be defending state laws if there's a defensible basis to do so.
All right. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.